Okay, so what we're doing today is we're just continuing our kind of recap. So last class or last online session, we only went through chapter 2. So today we're going to try to finish chapter 3. We'll see how we go. And I'm going to try to keep it as a recap and not as a recovering of our actual class and make it so detailed. I'll try to keep it as a recap. So obviously chapter 3, we began with looking at stress. We looked at the definition of stress, and we looked at the fact that stress wasn't just physiological, it wasn't just biological in nature, but it was also psychological as well. So when you're stressed, yes, you experience increased heart rate. Yes, you experienced increased release of cortisol and hormones and that kind of stuff. But you also experience things like lowered concentration. You also experience things like changes in your emotions. Okay, so all that kind of stuff is basically related to stress. And a person is stressed when they feel like they can't cope with their situation. So they feel like they don't have the ability or they don't have the resources to cope. So resources could be anything. It could be money. It could be materials. Sometimes you don't feel like you have the resources to cope or the physical or mental ability to cope. Okay, so that's what stress is about. Then we learned about the fact that stress is almost always caused by a stressor. And a stressor is basically any stimulus that causes or produces stress. So we're talking about things like a person, object, situation, or event. So we use the memory to POSE, P-O-S-E, to remember what a stressor can be. So we always have to write that it's a stimulus, it's not a thing, and you have to mention what are the 4 different types of things that a stressor can be. It can be a person, object, situation, or an event. We've got 2 types of stresses. Internal stresses come from inside the person. External stresses come from outside or the external environment. Okay, so that's just the basic definitions for what stress is about. Then we looked at these 2 forms of stress, which we call eustress and distress. Now, eustress is a positive psychological response to a stressor. It's not positive stress, it's a positive psychological response to a stressor. So there's those are 2 different things, okay? It's a positive psychological response to a stressor. It's positive because it's indicated by some kind of positive state, like you're happy, you're enthusiastic, you're alert. So planning your 18th birthday, it is a bit stressful, but then you get some joy or some happiness out of it. Going bungee jumping might be stressful, but you feel this adrenaline, you feel excited to go on this new experience. On the other hand, distress is negative. So it's always underlined by some kind of negative state. So you're angry, you're anxious, you're nervous, you're scared, or you're irritable or annoyed. Yeah.
Miss, end of year exams?
Uh-huh.
Are they still in November?
What the Premier said was that he said that the exams would still be running within this year. So they're not going to extend it into next year, because I think in his there was a line that said something like all VCE students will be guaranteed to have their VCE within 2020. So that means they're not going to carry it on to next year. That's what I understood from that statement.
It might be like November, December.
Yeah, because I think you'll be having your gap early in maybe late November or early December, and they might have your exams towards the end of maybe December or mid-December. They haven't, as far as I know, they haven't published an actual exam timetable yet. But yeah, I will let you guys know as soon as I get the date for that exam. Okay, but it should be happening. All VCE exams should be finalized within 2020. You shouldn't move into 2021. That's what they said. Yeah, so that's what distress is. So distress is that negative psychological response. So, basically if you've experienced a breakup in a relationship, or you're having trouble with friends or family, that could lead to distress, because a lot of the time no one's going to be happy if they kind of are fighting with other people. So that's what distress is about. So those are the 2 forms of stress. You need to be able to differentiate between the 2 and give an example for each. And this is a really easy topic, and most of you got this right on the SAC, if you remember. Okay, the next topic is called sources of stress. So whenever in a question you're asked about sources of stress, these are the things you need to talk about. Sources of stress are LADMC. So life events, acculturative stress, daily pressures, major stresses, and catastrophes. So these are the main sources of stress, okay? There are 5 of them. You need to know each of them, each of their definitions, and about 1 or 2 examples for each. So before we go into, whoops. Okay, hold on. This was supposed to be a summary. So basically, you should be able to differentiate between each of these in terms of like, how are they different from one another? So number one, daily pressures, you might remember, stresses or kind of stress or burdens that a person goes through every day. So it could be, as a VCE student, you studying for SACs every day, or you studying and finishing your homework every day and making sure the work doesn't pile up. For a person going to work, a daily pressure could be getting stuck in a traffic jam every day, or not being able to find a seat on the train every day. That could be a daily pressure, because it doesn't have to be super traumatic or super intense. It's just a kind of annoying thing that you have to experience every day. Okay, and that's why it's a daily pressure. Acculturative stress has the word culture in it. So acculturative stress is the kind of stress that you experience when you try to move into a new culture or adapt the ways of a different culture. So a lot of kind of our parents, when they first moved to Australia, they would have experienced acculturative stress because they're kind of attached to the culture from back home, but then kind of like trying to adapt to the new culture as well. Yes.
Miss, didn't we do this chapter already?
Yes, it's a recap.
Oh, I thought we did the sec for this.
Yes, we did, but it's a recap because we've completed Unit 3.
Oh, okay. Fair
Yeah,
enough.
because we always do a recap after we finish Unit 3. The stuff that we covered more recently, like chapters 5, 6, 7, those will be covered probably tomorrow and into next week as well. Okay?
Yeah.
Just a whole Unit 3 recap.
Okay, gotcha.
Major stresses. So major stresses are kind of more traumatic. They're stuff like, abuse. They're things that are very disturbing and distressing in nature. Life events are different from major stresses because life events happen to almost everyone. Major stresses don't happen to everyone. Not everyone will experience domestic violence or see their parents getting divorced, but everyone will at some point or the other experience the loss of a loved one. They might get a fine. Okay, these are more common. And catastrophes that impact whole communities are things like natural disasters like earthquakes, or man-made disasters like wars and civil conflict. So that's what a catastrophe is. Yes.
In terms of getting a fine, how is that
Yes.
a life event? Isn't that a daily pressure?
No, because unless you're someone who parks in the wrong place every day, or you every day, a life event isn't going to be it's not going to be a daily pressure because you're not going to experience it on the daily.
Okay.
Yeah, it's something that everyone will experience at some point in your life. Like, even if you're like the most careful driver like me, who literally never speeds and who like literally never does anything, I've already got like 4 parking fines, and it's like, that's not okay. So even if you're a careful person, at some point in your life you will receive a fine, whether it's a parking fine or a speeding fine. Just statistically, it just happens.
Okay, yeah.
So that's what a life event is. It just happens to everyone at least at one point in their life. Okay, daily,
Okay.
like the words that just happen every day or almost every day.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. So let's try this question now. So major stresses are one of the sources of stress that can affect individuals in their life. Give one example. So just identify or name one example of a major stressor now, just from the top of your head, remembering that major stresses are disturbing, traumatic, and distressing in nature. So I'm going to give you like literally 30 seconds because this is just a really easy question to write down in your exercise book or on a piece of paper now what you think one example of a major stress is. So 30 seconds, go, go, go.
Miss, loss of loved one will be one, right?
Sorry, which one? Loss of a loved one.
one.
I think we had this discussion when we covered the content last time. Loss of a loved one can actually fall into life events as well. So I would kind of suggest that you don't use that as an example for major stresses.
Okay.
Yeah. So think of something that's like super distressing or traumatic or like disturbing in nature. Alrighty, so time is up. Now, let's look at an example. yes, getting into a car accident can be an example of a major stressor because it doesn't happen to everyone at some point in their life. In fact, some people will drive for 50 years, they'll never get into a car accident. So it can be an example of a major stressor. Okay, but the one of the examples that you can talk about, or the most or best kind of memorized example by most students, is the one about abuse. Okay, so yes, getting kidnapped or abducted is another example of a very good answer for this. So think about like a super traumatic, something that's super traumatic or super disturbing, like being abused, getting abducted, getting kidnapped, almost getting murdered, getting raped. All of that stuff is like super distressing. It's super disturbing. And yeah, witnessing the suicide of a friend or seeing that firsthand, that is like super stressful. And that's not a life event because not everyone will experience that in their life. Okay, life events are a lot more general and common in the population. Major stresses are a lot less common, but can still happen, okay, to people, but not to every single person. Not every single child in this world would have been abused, okay, but every single child will experience a first day of school, which is a life event. So remember, students always get confused between major stresses and life events, so just make sure you can differentiate between the two. Alrighty, awesome. So let's move on to the next topic, which is, so the rest of this chapter, if you remember, kind of looked at stress as a biological process. So it kind of looked at the biological explanation for stress, the psychological explanation for stress, and kind of more social explanations for stress. So the biological model for stress is called the general adaptation syndrome. General adaptation syndrome is basically a chain of events or a chain of reactions that occur when a person is confronted by a stressor. So basically, when we're talking about the GAS syndrome or the general adaptation syndrome, the GAS model, what it's basically talking about is that there are three main stages, okay? So the first stage is alarm reaction. So when you first encounter a stressor in the environment, so you first realize that, oh my God, you didn't do well on the SAC, your body goes into shock, okay? So your blood pressure, your body temperature drop, there's a temporary loss of muscle tone. The body then rebounds from this state because this state that we see in shock is actually the sympathetic nervous system, kind of preparing to be activated, but not yet activated. So this is the freeze response. The sympathetic nervous system then activates or rebounds from the shock state by presenting the fight-flight response. So the fight-flight response is when the sympathetic nervous system fully activates, and basically this allows your heart rate to increase and allows all those physical reactions to happen that allows you to then deal with the stressor. Your body then goes into the resistance stage. The resistance stage is when you're trying your best to resist, to fight against, to cope with that stressor, okay? You're trying your best to deal with that stressor in a successful way. So this is the stage when your body is essentially fighting with the stressor. It's kind of like a battle of the stressor versus you. And in this, obviously, whenever you get into a fight or whenever, you imagine your body versus you in like a battle ring, you'll realize that you are putting everything you have to kind of overcome that stressor, okay? You are putting everything you can to win that fight. So all your unnecessary bodily functions are shut down, digestion, growth, all that stuff is shut down. And all the hormones that you're going to need to deal with the stressor, like cortisol, adrenaline, all of that is released in big amounts to help you to overcome and fight the stressor. Now, because you're using up all these bodily resources, your immune system does start to become suppressed or kind of start to become weakened in the resistance stage, okay? Now, exhaustion stage is the stage where your body has exhausted. It's used up, it's become so tired from fighting, and it's basically now exhausted. So it's not able to cope anymore, okay? And in exhaustion, the person is really weak because their immune system was already suppressed from the previous stage and it continues to become deteriorated in the exhaustion stage. A person is very likely to develop actual serious disease like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and they can also show symptoms of like mental health conditions and things in exhaustion as well. Okay, so remember, the immune system starts to get suppressed in resistance stage, but the actual full-blown disease starts to occur in exhaustion stage. Okay, and remember, depending on the situation, you might not even see the exhaustion stage happening. So if the organism or the person successfully copes with the stressor, so let's say after the SAC, you're really stressed, but then you talk to your friends and they're like, you know what, don't worry about it. The SAC was only worth 3%. Then you're like, oh, okay, thank God, that's good. then you're not going to go into exhaustion stage because you have overcome the stressor by evaluating the actual situation. So that, yeah, that's basically the GAS model. So hopefully that is kind of clear. The other biological model or biological process of stress, which we have to know, because again, it is related to the GAS model as well, is the fight, flight, freeze response. So we know that the freeze response is basically our shock stage, and the fight, flight response comes in our counter shock of the alarm reaction. So basically the fight, flight, freeze response is an involuntary, which means it's automatic response that occurs when there's an immediate threat in the environment. So in the fight, flight, freeze response, the organism either fights the threat, which means they confront and they approach it directly. Flight means they flee or they run away from the threat, or freeze means that they remain still and silent without moving. So cortisol is very important for us to know because cortisol is the primary or the major stress hormone, okay? Whenever someone is stressed, cortisol is released. Cortisol helps us to deal with stress because it actually helps to direct energy to your muscles. So blood glucose is kind of your blood sugar, and all that sugar, all that blood glucose is traveling to your muscles, which is going to help you to run away from the stressor if you have to. It's going to boost your metabolism. And one of the main things we said was bad about cortisol was that it actually suppresses the immune system temporarily. Now, if you've got small amounts of stress in your life, this is not a big deal. But if you're constantly stressed every day, or you're in a situation where you're always under stress, like you're in a domestic violence kind of situation or environment, or you know, you're working in some kind of top management position where you've always got like workload on top of your head, that would then mean that cortisol would actually be suppressing your immune system on an ongoing basis, which means that you're more likely to fall into the exhaustion stage where you actually develop disease. Okay, so that's basically all you need to know for the biological processes of stress. You've got to know the GAS model, the fight, flight, freeze response, and the role of cortisol. Okay, and obviously everything on this slide you will have to know in order to properly understand the GAS model, because this is all related to the previous slide as well. Okay, then we looked at stress as a psychological model. So the psychological model for stress is called the LAZARUS and FOLKMAN'S transactional model of stress and coping. And what it suggested was that stress is in the eye of the beholder. So generally when a person goes through stress, they will experience a very unique kind of interpretation of that stressor as compared to someone else. So if there's a sack coming up, some of you might get super stressed about it, but some of you who maybe might be a little more organized or maybe don't care as much for the sack, you won't let that get you too stressed, or you won't let that really get the better of you. Whereas some of you might be a little bit more worried and get a little bit more worked up and stressed about it. So this model basically suggests that we can have one stressor, one example of a stressful situation, and two people will interpret that differently. Okay, hence why we call this model, or why I often say that this model shows that idea of stress is in the eye of the beholder. Now in this model, in the LAZARUS and FOLKMAN'S transactional model, you might remember I gave you guys this example of the sack being moved to tomorrow. So the teacher saying that, okay guys, the sack that was next week is now tomorrow. So two people will interpret that differently. The guy who doesn't really care, or is just taking psych as a sick subject, might be like, okay, don't care, whatever. The guy who's kind of wanting to do really well in the subject, or who gets a little bit too worked up about everything, might be like, oh my God, my life is over. So one person is appraising this as quite stressful. The other person is appraising it as irrelevant. Okay, and remember we use these keywords to basically describe a person's interpretation or appraisal of a stressor. So in the primary appraisal stage, that's the initial stage where you are trying to interpret, okay, what does this stressor mean to me? Is it irrelevant? Is it benign, harmless, or is it positive, or is it stressful? Now, only if we choose stressful, you would remember that we actually move on to the next stage. And in that stage, we further evaluate what kind of effect that stressor is going to have on you. And secondary appraisal is another word for coping. So obviously, only if you actually thought the stressor was stressful will you go into the coping stage. If you thought that, hey, this stressor was irrelevant, like this guy in this picture here, you won't even move into the coping stage because it wasn't stressful for you to begin with. So what would you have to cope with? There's nothing for you to cope with. So obviously, the general idea here is that the way we interpret or appraise a stressor is going to influence the way we respond to that stressor and thus influence how we cope with that stressor, or if we even have to cope with that stressor, okay? So that's basically how the appraisals are made in the transactional model of stress and coping. Now, hopefully, all of this kind of makes a little bit of sense to everybody. I know we covered it a while back, but yeah, it should be quite straightforward. Are there any questions though about this model? Because I know this model can get a little bit confusing. No? All good? Okay, cool. So in that case, I think we can probably, yeah, I already talked about coping, but yeah, coping is basically how you're going to manage the demands of the stressor, either through thinking about it, so changing the way you think about the stressor, or through actual behavioral efforts. Now, when we're talking about coping, there are two types of coping that come under secondary appraisal. So remember, secondary appraisal is just another word for coping. So the first one is problem-focused coping, and the second one is emotion-focused coping. Now, problem-focused coping is you actually doing something to address the root cause or the source of the problem. Emotion-focused coping isn't really addressing the cause of the problem, but it's addressing your emotions towards the problem. So in problem-focused coping, if the SAC was postponed to tomorrow, you'll actually be studying for the SAC. You'll be watching Adrolo videos. You'll be emailing me questions, okay? So stuff that actually helps you to deal with the problem, which is that the SAC is tomorrow and that you've got to study. Emotion-focused coping is dealing with your emotions. So if you're feeling really upset or really frustrated about the fact that I've postponed the SAC to tomorrow, you might decide to eat some ice cream. You might decide to vent about it on, I don't know, Instagram, or, you know, yeah, you know, just like, I don't know, eat chocolate or something like that, okay? So you're basically trying to deal with your emotions of the problem. Obviously, emotion-focused coping isn't dealing with the problem itself. So some people would say it's a less productive source of coping, but I would say that both coping methods are quite important, and you know, both of them are sometimes important for us to deal with the stress. Okay, sometimes we're in a mood where like, yep, I'm going to deal with this problem head on. I'm going to use problem-focused coping. But sometimes you're just so emotionally wrecked that you need to take some time out, practice some self-care, and look after your emotions as well. Okay, so both of these methods of coping can be used under the transactional model. Right, so then we looked at the strengths and limitations. So remember, you just have to know at least 2 strengths and 2 limitations. And they're all kind of there on the slide. So I'm not going to go through them in depth, but just learn the 2 strengths and 2 limitations, and understand why that is a strength and why that is a limitation. So obviously, just to give you an example, using human participants in developing the model is obviously a strength, because the way that humans experience stress is different from the way that a rabbit or a mouse or a monkey would experience stress, okay? We have different kind of psychological processes behind experiencing stress compared to animals. So using human participants in developing this model was something good that Lazarus and FOLKMAN actually did. Okay, so be able to explain why that is a strength or why that is a limitation. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys about maybe 3 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes now, to read through this question and just jot down a quick response as to what you think the answer might be. Okay. So I'll put 3 minutes now on the clock for you guys to try this out. Yep.
Hey, Mance, I'm back.
Hi.
What are we doing?
Just this practice question now.
Oh, okay, so we finished chapter 3.
No, not yet.
Not yet.
It's not that
Alright.
easy. Okay, we're just we're doing chapter 3 now, so we're still halfway through.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so I've got another 20 seconds and then I will show you guys a potential answer for this. Okay, so the question is, Timothy and his girlfriend have had an argument and they have not been speaking for many days. This has caused Timothy to become very stressed. He has spent the last few days watching Netflix, eating junk food, and lying in bed. Yesterday, however, he tried calling his girlfriend once to talk things through, but she did not pick up the phone. Frustrated, Timothy again decided to sit in his room and mope. Describe Timothy's primary appraisal to his stressor in this situation and indicate any potential further appraisals he might make. So obviously we're talking about primary appraisal here, which is the initial interpretation. So there were some key words that you have to use, okay? So I'll show you guys what the answer is first. So it says that also you need to indicate any potential further appraisals he might make. So number one, the first mark you get for this question will be you naming the actual primary appraisal. And the second mark you get is for naming the further appraisal or naming any further appraisal he might make, okay? Now, obviously, you do need to link to the scenario. So you do need to use Timothy's name in the situation. You do need to kind of link to the stressor, which is his relationship and all that kind of stuff. So you could write, Timothy would be making a stressful primary appraisal. And I've just quoted that information from the scenario that says he's very stressed. You can quote any word from the scenario that suggests that he is stressed. So other words could be things like overwhelmed or worried or, concerned. So any kind of word or adjective that suggests that Timothy is stressed or that he's not okay could be used as an example. Again, you don't have to quote information from the scenario here, but I always think it's good to get into a habit of doing that because it shows that you are integrating the stimulus material. He then might make a further appraisal of threat. So I've decided to choose threat as my further appraisal because it's the easiest one for me to think of an example for. Remember I said that it's a lot easier for you to think of an example for threat because it's easier for us to judge how a stressor might affect someone in the future as compared to how it's already affected that person, which is what we do when we talk about harm or loss. Okay, so a threat as he might feel that their relationship is at risk in the future and that they could break up. Okay, so that's basically where the 2 marks come from. You basically get the marks just for identifying the key terms and linking to the scenario. Now, you don't need to talk about problem-focused or emotion-focused coping at all because the question only asks you for the primary appraisal, okay? And coping comes under the secondary. Cool, so hopefully all of you had something similar in terms of the keywords there. Now, this is a really easy question, just 1 mark. Now, using the information in that scenario, identify Timothy's secondary appraisal to his stressor. So I'm just going to move back to the scenario and I want you to have a look at what do you think his secondary appraisal here was? So what kind of attempt did he make now to cope with that stressor? And I'll show you guys the answer like in about 15 to 20 seconds. Okay, so remember secondary appraisal is about the way that we cope with a stressor. So we're just trying to look at how did Timothy try to cope with the stressor in this case? Okay, so if you look at the scenario, you'll notice that he tried calling his girlfriend to talk things through, but she did not pick up the phone. So remember, when we're looking at a coping example in a scenario, it doesn't always have to be successful coping. It can even be just an attempt that was made to try and cope with the scenario. So an example of an answer you could talk about was, you could talk about the fact that he uses problem-focused coping when he calls his girlfriend to talk things through. Now that's problem-focused because he's trying to deal with the actual relationship issue by talking about it. Or you can talk about the fact that Timothy used emotion-focused coping, which was kind of the less productive coping method, but it was still good to cheer him up and to make him feel a little bit better. So he watched Netflix and ate junk food by himself. So obviously, by now you guys should know that secondary appraisal is always related to coping. So you don't want to talk about stressful or harm, loss or threat or challenge in this question. This is only about coping. So as long as you named one of these and linked it to the scenario, you would get the 1 mark for that question. Okay, so let's move on now to the last few topics now of chapter 3, which looked at kind of the social-based strategies for dealing with stress or related to stress. So the first one is called context-specific effectiveness, and this is again to do with the coping, how we're going to cope with the stressor. So context-specific effectiveness is basically this concept that tries to explain, is the person using a proper method or a proper strategy to deal with their stressful situation? Context-specific effectiveness means, is the coping strategy or method or the thing that I'm doing to cope with the stressor effective for the context? Is it specific for the context or for the stressful situation? Okay, when we say context, it basically means the stressful situation. So obviously, if your stressor is an upcoming oral presentation you have to do in front of the class, and you're just sitting at home, not even writing your speech, not even practicing your speech, that's not going to be a good method. And for that reason, I would say that that is an example of a coping method that is low in context-specific effectiveness, because it's not a good fit, it's not effective in dealing with the actual stressful situation or the context. If, on the other hand, you are writing your speech up, you put it on cue cards, you've practiced it like a few times in front of the mirror, in front of your family or in front of people, and you're really working on your presentation, your eye contact, your hand gestures, all that kind of stuff, I would then say that that is an example of a coping method that is high in context-specific effectiveness, because it is a good fit for the stressful situation and it is helping to effectively deal with or address the stressful situation in this example. Okay, so basically in context-specific effectiveness, we're saying that we can divide coping strategies or coping methods or examples into 2 types, either being high in context-specific effectiveness, which means that the coping strategy is good for dealing with the stressful situation, or low in context-specific effectiveness, which means that the coping strategy is bad or is a poor example for dealing with the stressful situation. Then we move on to coping flexibility. Now remember, coping flexibility is how flexible you are, how kind of open-minded or how kind of like ready you are to change your coping method if it doesn't work. So remember the picture of the lady with all these different options that she's thinking about, okay? Coping flexibility is basically your ability or your capacity to consider a stressful situation. And if one plan or one example of a coping method doesn't work, you choose another one. So let's say if plan A doesn't work, you go for plan B. If plan B doesn't work, you go for plan C, okay? Generally, a person with high coping flexibility will not give up easily in terms of dealing with their stressor. And for that reason, they'll think of many different options or plans of other ways or alternative options to deal with the stressor. And they will generally overcome stresses more successfully compared to a person who has low coping flexibility, who's more closed-minded, who gives up easily, who if plan A doesn't work is like, you know what, I give up. Plan A didn't work. I don't want to even think about plan B. I just will never deal with this stressor. Okay. Having said that, you could even say that people with high coping flexibility tend to be more positive in terms of the way they think, whereas people with low coping flexibility might be a little bit more negative or more pessimistic in terms of the way they think. And that does influence their ability to look at the stressor and cope with the stressor. So that is basically what coping flexibility is about.
Miss, can we do an example for this?
Coping flexibility? Yeah, so we can say, for example, let's say that 2 people are studying for a SAC, okay? And it's a really difficult topic. And it's like the day before the SAC and they're still struggling to understand it. Maybe their teacher is away from school, so they can't contact their teacher. And let's say the other psych teacher's on an excursion, so they're not even in school. So these 2 kids don't know what they're going to do. So let's say that student A is kind of like a little bit more positive in terms of the way they think. they're a little bit more higher in terms of coping flexibility. So they might be like, okay, I don't really understand this topic, but why don't I search on Edrolo for an explanation of it? Or why don't I go onto YouTube and search for an explanation of it? Or why don't I read through my notes again? Or why don't I ask that other girl in year, in year 12 who did psych as a 3 and 4 last year? She might be able to help me. So rather than giving up because plan A didn't work and you couldn't understand the content, you're actually exploring other options or other ideas to help you understand the content. Yeah, does that make sense? Whereas the person, student B, might give up straight away. They might be like, you know what, I don't get this content. I've read through Miss Farouin's slides. It doesn't make any sense, whatever. I'm just going to give up. I'm going to hope that there's not a question on this in the SAC. I just don't want to do this anymore. So they kind of give up a little bit more easily rather than exploring other options.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that is basically what coping flexibility is. Then we looked at the last kind of strategy, or like one of the last strategies we looked at was exercise. We talked about the fact that exercise is good for coping with stress because it can help us from a physiological point of view by enhancing our immune system, by using up cortisol in our bodies. But it can also kind of act as a psychological benefit in the sense that it distracts us. You know, when you're running or when you're doing exercise, you're not thinking about the stressor. Some people actually use strength training, or they use strength training as a way to vent out their anger that they've built up inside of them. And for some people, exercise can actually act as kind of a natural stress release because it can also release beta endorphins, which are basically substances that can promote relaxation in your body and make you feel good. So that's how exercise can be used as a coping strategy. So remember, you just need to know at least 2 or 3 of these little colored boxes here. Try to know one that's relevant to the physiological benefit and maybe one that's relevant to the psychological benefit. Okay? And especially you need to be able to link each of these to stress. So for example, by increasing efficiency of the cardiovascular system, exercise can help you deal with stress because it gives you more cardiovascular capacity and fitness and endurance to actually run away if a bear is to suddenly pop up on the street, or if someone is chasing you with a knife in their hand or something like that. Okay, so obviously you got to link each of these to stress. So just know at least 2 or 3 from this slide here. That should be more than enough.
Miss?
Yeah?
Do you need to know the stress hormones for this?
You
Like
don't
how
have
they
to
help
learn
you
that
fight?
one. You don't have to learn that one, but I think as a general knowledge, it would be good for you to understand that exercise does use up your stress hormones.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you've already learned about cortisol, so you just kind of...
So we can add that in our answer, right? If we're explaining.
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah. Yeah, that would be a really good example because you are then using that keyword that we've learned about before as well, cortisol. Yeah?
Yeah.
Cool. Now, I think the last 2 topics that we're going through today are the approach and avoidance strategies. So obviously, we're looking at approach coping strategies as being kind of similar to our problem-focused coping, okay? When a person uses an approach coping strategy, they are directly approaching that stressor. They're directly confronting and they're directly dealing with the source of the stressor. So as you can see in this image here, if you feel like your friend is acting a little bit different with you, or they're not really speaking to you as much or as well as they used to, and that's building up a lot of stress inside you or a lot of tension, you might actually sit down with them and talk about it. Like, be like, okay, you know, what's up? Why are you acting like this? Is something wrong? And by directly approaching that stressful situation, you're helping to reduce the stress that you're feeling. Because maybe your friend's just not in a good mood or has had a bad week, and it's not really anything personally related to you. An avoidant coping strategy, on the other hand, might involve making an effort to avoid, or in other words, to escape, to prevent confrontation, or to evade a stressor. Evade a stressor means you're trying to dodge the stressor. You're trying to not confront that stressor head on. So obviously, if you've got an upcoming exam, rather than opening up trial exams and doing your exams or doing practice questions or revising, you might try to escape this stress or block it out from your head by watching some TV or by having a nap or something like that. Something that doesn't help you to deal directly with that stressor. So that is what we call as an avoidant coping strategy. Okay, so that's basically approach and avoidance. And remember, we make a contrast with approach coping strategies are very similar, almost identical to problem-focused coping. Okay, if we're talking about an example of problem-focused coping, that will almost always be an example of an approach coping strategy. If we're talking about an example of emotion-focused coping from the transactional model, that will almost always be reflecting that avoidant coping strategy. Okay, so this topic is very much linked to the types of coping that we learned about a few slides back. What on earth have I done here? I've put in a slide which I should not have exposed the answers to, which was from a few slides back. Okay, we'll just skip this slide because I've done something funny there. Okay, now before we finish, because we are finishing at 12 today, so you still got 10 minutes, I'm just going to run through chapter 4. It's literally like 6 slides long, so I thought we'll just get it out of the way. So basically in chapter 4, we looked at the neural basis of learning and memory. So when we talk about learning and memory, there are a few definitions you need to know. The main 2 definitions are here. So number 1, learning refers to a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. If we ever ask you, or if Vika ever asks you to define learning, this is the definition you want to be giving, okay? Because this is the definition that contains the 2 key words, which is number 1, relatively permanent change in behavior. Number 2, as a result of experience. We can't learn anything just by sitting in our beds all day. We have to go out. We have to experience, we have to experience things in order to learn from them. So if I'm going to learn how to bake a cake, I need to go into the kitchen and do that. I can't just learn simply from watching someone do it, okay? Remember, in observational learning, it's not just about attention and retention. There's reproduction as well. So you always have to go through some kind of experience where you are trying to reproduce some behavior that you've seen or that you've observed. Memory, the definition for memory is that it's about the storage and retrieval of information that is acquired through learning or through encoding, okay? So that is basically our memory definition that has to contain the 3 main components, which is encoding, storage, and retrieval. Now, neuroplasticity, you've already learned about neuroplasticity last year, but neuroplasticity is basically how the brain changes in terms of its structure or function as you go through different experiences in the lifespan. And those experiences could be like just an experience of you growing up, which is what we call developmental plasticity, or it could be actual environmental experiences like getting struck in the head with a football or getting into a car accident and suffering a head injury. Okay, and that's what we call adaptive plasticity. So neuroplasticity, similar to the way that plastic is very flexible and can be molded. So when you think about plastic wrap or glad wrap or cling wrap, you can really mold that over anything. You can take a piece of plastic wrap, you can wrap it around anything. It just takes on the shape of that thing that you are wrapping or that thing that you are molding it into or shaping it into. Similar to that, that's why we say neuroplasticity is talking about how the brain is like plastic in the sense that the brain changes its shape, it changes its structure, it changes its function according to the experiences that it is exposed to throughout your life. Okay, so that's what neuroplasticity is about. We looked at this concept of long-term potentiation, which should be really straightforward to all of you now, that we finished memory as well. Long-term potentiation is basically that whenever we learn something initially or when we go back and relearn it or revise it again, synaptic connections start to increase for that information. And every time you revise that information, those synaptic connections actually become strengthened and really strong and really consolidated. And what that means essentially is that the stronger the synaptic or neural connections between a pre and post-synaptic neuron, the stronger will be your memory of that particular knowledge or of that particular topic or skill. So obviously, this idea that practice makes perfect is actually kind of like reflected in this concept of long-term potentiation, that the more you practice something, whether it be academic knowledge, like learning the lock and key process, or whether it be kind of like procedural knowledge, like riding a bike, the more you do it, the more the neural connections between the synapses or between the neurons involved with holding that information will get strengthened, okay? And that will mean that your memory of the information is stronger. So a lot of the time, for example, people who do like tutoring for certain subjects or people who are teachers, we cover the same content essentially every single year. And every time we reteach that every year, the synaptic connections between our neurons involved with holding that information get stronger and stronger, which is why after a while we don't need a textbook to be able to tell you the definition of something. It's just really strong held in our memory, okay? And you'll find that the more you
revise.
Sorry?
the more you revise, the better synaptic connections, right?
Exactly. The stronger your synaptic connections will become.
Yeah.
Okay. And that is basically this idea of long-term potentiation, that the more you revise information, the more these neurons will be communicating with one another, and the more likely that there will be to connect with one another when you're revising that same information again. So they kind of become familiar with one another, and they form this kind of connection or relationship. So next time you're revising your timetables or revising the definition of lock and key, neuron A and neuron B are like, yep, it's time for us to connect again. She's revising that same topic again. And so they are more likely to connect to one another again. Okay, so that's long-term potentiation. It's the long-lasting strengthening of the synaptic connections that are involved with your learning of some kind of information. Okay, the opposite of long-term potentiation is long-term depression. And so you can guess that long-term depression obviously occurs when you haven't learned information or revised information in a very long time. So generally what happens when you're not revising information for a very long time is that the synaptic connections between the neurons, which is basically this image here, those little yellow dots, that's the synaptic connections, right? Those synaptic connections, or that kind of connection, that kind of strong connection that was established, starts to kind of disconnect. It starts to become weaker. And for that reason, your memory of that information that you'd initially learned starts to disintegrate. It starts to become kind of poor. You start to forget parts of it. So if you haven't revised the definition of lock and key process in a long time, or you haven't defined, you haven't revised potential confounding variables because we haven't done research methods in a long time, you will realize that your knowledge or your memory of what you thought you knew about that topic has actually started to disintegrate. You've actually started to forget parts of the definition or parts of content, or you start to confuse potential confounding variables with something like extraneous variables, and you get everything confused. So essentially, long-term depression is the biological explanation for why we forget information if we haven't revised that information in a long time. It's because there is a long-lasting weakening of the synaptic connections between the pre and the postsynaptic neurons. And for that reason, obviously, we will see a kind of decrease in the memory that you have of that particular information. So that's basically what our long-term depression is about. Okay, long-term depression is about that long-lasting weakening of the synaptic connections involved with our memory of some information. Does that make sense to everybody? Hopefully.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, cool. Almost done. 2 more slides. Then we looked at the role of glutamate in synaptic plasticity. Glutamate is also something that's very kind of similar. That's very kind of similar to this concept of, you know, long-term potentiation. So synaptic plasticity and long-term potentiation are basically almost the same thing. Without synaptic plasticity, we cannot have long-term potentiation to begin with, okay? So glutamate, as we learned in chapter 2 or in the last session when we did our recap, is an example of an excitatory neurotransmitter, which means that it basically stimulates pre- and postsynaptic neurons to communicate with one another. It stimulates that neural firing. Okay, so basically, because glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter, and we said that it is excitatory because it's the green traffic light, and it stimulates memory and learning processes, okay? How it stimulates memory and learning processes is that when the pre- and postsynaptic neuron are communicating with one another, and this little cartoon diagram shows you like a little gap there, which is the synapse, the actual neurotransmitter involved, or that's released into the synaptic gap when we're learning something, is glutamate, okay? And for that reason, glutamate obviously has a role in synaptic plasticity and long-term potentiation, because it is the neurotransmitter that is promoting that strengthening of the synaptic connections. Remember, synaptic connections can only be strengthened and can only be built up and consolidated if an excitatory neurotransmitter such as glutamate is being released into the synaptic gap. If we've got some inhibitory neurotransmitter like GABA being released, the neural connections are not going to be strengthened, they're actually going to be weakened. Okay, so remember, glutamate plays a big role in learning and memory, and for that reason, it plays a big role in synaptic plasticity, or essentially the strengthening of synaptic connections between neurons, which is long-term potentiation. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Cool. As long as you can connect these topics, so remember synaptic plasticity influences long-term potentiation, and glutamate is involved with both synaptic plasticity and long-term potentiation for that reason. So try to connect the topics rather than viewing them as completely separate topics, because all of this is kind of related across all the chapters now. Okay, our last slide that we're going through for today, and then I promise I will stop, is role of neurohormones. So obviously, when we talked about neurohormones, I told you guys there's only one neurohormone you have to learn for the whole of Unit 3 and Unit 4 for that matter, and that neurohormone is called adrenaline. Okay, adrenaline is a neurohormone because it's released not into the brain, not into the synaptic gap, but released directly into the bloodstream. Okay, and that's why you might have heard the saying of, you know, people saying, oh, I've got adrenaline pumping through my veins. Okay, adrenaline pumping through your veins is this clue or this idea that adrenaline is not released into the synaptic gap like glutamate. It's actually released directly into your bloodstream. Now, adrenaline plays a role in memory and learning because it has everything to do with your memory of emotionally arousing experiences. So if you went through an experience where you were scared, anxious, frustrated, or furious, something where you're like super stressed or you're in a intense or heightened state of emotional arousal, adrenaline is going to be released. So let's say you fought in the war, or let's say you were waiting outside your job interview, your first job interview ever. Or let's say that you were, you were kind of running away from someone who was trying to steal your purse or abduct you or something like that, something that was really scary. The first thing that happens for that memory to be really stored quite strongly or consolidated is that adrenaline will be released. Now, when adrenaline is released, the amygdala gets this signal that adrenaline has been released. And so what the amygdala does is that it then releases noradrenaline. Noradrenaline is a counter hormone to adrenaline. It works with adrenaline to make sure that the effects of adrenaline are not too intense on the person's body. Now, when the amygdala releases noradrenaline, it also then sends a signal to the hippocampus. Now remember, the hippocampus is the site or the heart of consolidation of all long-term memories, and it also consolidates all of our emotionally intense memories as well. So obviously the amygdala sends a signal to the hippocampus saying that, okay, this person is pretty scared right now. This experience could be important for their survival, or it could be important to remember for future instances. So I'm gonna need you to consolidate or fix this memory strongly into the long-term memory. And so the hippocampus is like, okay, yep, just give me about 30 minutes to do this. In 30 minutes, the hippocampus will have consolidated this emotionally arousing or emotionally traumatic or scarring memory into that person's long-term memory, okay? If in that 30 minutes that person was wounded or that person suffered a head injury or they passed out, that memory might not be consolidated strongly, but the person might still remember parts of it because, again, emotionally charged memories are always remembered very strongly as compared to neutral memories that don't have much emotion attached to them, okay? So that's because the amygdala, and the amygdala does send that signal to the hippocampus straight away to consolidate that memory into long-term memory. Okay, is everyone good with this slide? Yes?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so I know we haven't done chapter 4 in terms of a SAC yet. In fact, you were supposed to do this SAC before we left for holidays, but sadly, Corona came in and destroyed all my plans. So what we're going to do anyway is we are going to be doing the chapter 4 to 7 SAC once we resume with school, whenever that is. So if you do come across any other questions you couldn't think of right now for chapter 4 content, just ask me in the next session. For this week though, there has been a Unit 3 trial exam that has been uploaded under the week 4 trial. You might have already seen it. That's not going to be like marked as a SAC or anything. That's just for you to complete. So me and Miss B get an idea of how you guys are going with that. I want you guys to start working on that now in the offline session and try to submit it by this Sunday night. Just try your best. It doesn't matter if you get 100% or 40% on it. I don't really care. I just want you guys to try your best, and I want you to just get an idea of what practice exam type questions look like. Okay, we've done quite a few past VICA exams. This is just another example of exam with like VCA style questions. Okay, I want you guys to do this as well and take it quite seriously, because we will be marking this online, and I will be sending this back to you with a score and with some feedback. So when you open up that Word document, on the first page where you normally would write your name, just write your email address there, so then I can email that exam back to you with the feedback and comments on it. Okay, and obviously do type up the responses to the exam. Don't print it out and write it, because it's easier to type the responses, I think. Okay, so that's about it for today. So we've covered chapter 3 and 4 recap. Now tomorrow we have another online session, so I'll try to cover chapter 5 if possible tomorrow, and then we'll maybe use one more period next week to go through chapter 6 and 7, which we shouldn't have to go in too much depth because we just covered them recently. So those of you who are all good and don't have any other questions, you're free to now move on to the Schoolbox class page and download that trial exam, and maybe start with some of the multiple choice in that, or some of the short answer, whatever you like. Those of you who have any questions, I'm still going to hang around until about 12:15 or however long I have to. So yeah, just like if you're all good, you can move on to the Schoolbox class page now, and I will stop the recording here.